Dr. McKenna, what is top of mind for you today?
Well, Sabbath, our recent guest, we had Stephen Covey on the Wild Conversation podcast. He kind of blew me away. It was just to immediately meet a kindred spirit, someone in the battle for trust and the battle for whole leaders. And we just immediately, I think you and I both felt that. And one of the things at the end that struck me, because when he wrote his book, Speed of Trust, and I think it published in 2006, he talked over and over again about something that we are obsessive about this reality that you can measure trust. And he said it, he was just repeating that story, and he talked about this, that he was focused on the outcome. So if you can measure, what he focuses on is speed. If you can increase speed and decrease cost, you can measure trust. And so when we asked him, like, what's the future? I said, where does research need to go next? Where does the focus need to be next? He went straight at, he said, what are the levers? We need to understand the levers that we have to be able to pull, what researchers would call the antecedents, the things before trust. So what are the things? And if we measured those things and we could triangulate on trust from the outcome side and also the driver's side. And so of course I got fired up because that's what we did. And it's what we did and what we discovered as a result of these years and years of work. And so I'm so excited. It was an awesome conversation. I can't wait for people to hear. But I'm just as excited for this conversation. If Stephen Covey's a new friend, this is a friend. You have old friends, and then you have kind of in between friends that feel like old friends. That's our guest today. So let's get this going.
Welcome to the Wild Conversation, where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, back by popular demand, we get to have a wild conversation with our friend and strategic affiliate, Sam Willing. We're so excited to have this time together again to dive into our State of Trust at Work report. We're going to play a quick round of wild cards before we get started. Sam, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor.
We're going to play a quick game, and you're well familiar with this, and I think our guests are getting familiar with how we do wild cards. We are going to change it up a little bit. Instead of us picking a number, I'll just pick a card from the deck, and we'll all answer the same question. So we have a deck of 50 cards. Each question is developmentally focused, and it's an opportunity that we play with leaders across the nation to dive quick into getting to know each other in an intentional way. So today, our question is, are you more of a truth speaker or a peacekeeper? I'll go first. Sam, you can go next, and Rob will round us out. I am more of a truth speaker or peacekeeper. I am more of a peacekeeper. There's a story behind that because sometimes I think it depends who I'm talking with. There are some situations where I feel like I have the guts to speak more truth, but often I've made it a habit, for good or bad, that I will be more of a peacekeeper. So I'm working on trending upward in both.
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, I would say for me, same. I am in my corporate environment, in my coaching roles, in my professional life, I am a truth speaker, always through the lens of compassion. In my personal life, I tend to be more of a peacekeeper. So in family system, in relationships, and I am really working on being more of a truth speaker in my personal relationships, because as much as I have built an expertise around having hard conversations in my corporate life and in my coaching, I really can sometimes try to avoid and run from hard conversations in my personal life. So that is something in this back half of life that I'm working on.
That's so
Thanks
good,
for sharing.
Sam,
Yeah.
and Sabbath. So it's funny when I hear this question because I wrote a book that's all about this. That composed book is that focus. And I would say that authors write things, to basically kind of serve themselves. You're trying to understand yourself. And it might surprise a lot of people, but I would have to say that in most situations I default to the peacekeeper side, meaning that I have a very, and it gets in my way, a very strong sort of emotional connection to what other people are thinking, needing, and feeling. And there's a whole story about that, even the way that I've structured my work and our business to make sure that I keep that at bay. But I do flip sometimes, and that's why people were like, "You have so much conviction, and you can't help but speak what you perceive as the truth." And so I feel that same thing you were describing, both of you. That, and I think that's the thing. It's a developmental attribute. It's not a personality trait. And so for me, I think I feel very similar to the two of you. That is good stuff, Sabbath. So this is so great, Sam, to have you back. And like Sabbath said, from by popular demand. Um, and I would love to just dig in. First of all, what's going on in Sam Willing's life right now?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, I'm so happy to be back. And I am also so excited for Wild that Stephen Covey is a new friend. What if you're
Uh,
going to have a new friend in the leadership space? What a friend to have. So,
yeah.
so what is new for me? I think I mentioned this last time, but I'm in the process of writing my first book. And it is on the power of being a regulated leader. And so your book Composed was quite an inspiration for me, but really it's just a culmination of my 29 years of HR experience, my own life altering event of losing my mom a couple of years ago, and really digging into regulation work, so emotional and nervous system regulation, and then really understanding what a huge impact my ability to show up regulated had on my leadership and the people around me. And also it shined this bright light on what I think is foundational to leadership and something that showed up in the trust report, which is your stress response and ability to stay composed under pressure. So I'm in the throes of that, first time author. Lots of joy and fulfillment and creativity and also angst all mixed together, but it's fun. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. Okay, so that is awesome because as you know, it's a big push on my heart as well that emotional regulation is a massive driver of trust, of
Yeah.
performance. It's a key leadership attribute. I'd say that it's the delta between the good leaders
Yeah.
and the great ones that is too rarely spoken about. And it's an important but complex topic that we have to tackle. And it's so critical for us. So I know, and Sabbath, we both have lots of questions that we want to have this conversation and to frame it. So I know that you have continued to dig into the trust report. And
Yeah.
I'd love to just frame our conversation and research, and just to get it started, and then see where we go.
Yeah.
As you've been digging through that research on the drivers of trust and trust in general, what are some of the things that are standing out to you? Let's just get this
Mm.
party going.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so many things. One of the things towards the beginning of the trust report that I loved because I have such a heart, of course, for people and leadership development was a statement. I may get it a little bit off, but a statement essentially that every people and leader development activity is actually a trust building activity. And so for me, that statement, there is so much truth to that. It's been my lived experience in organizations as a culture leader and as a coach. And I think this idea that trust is relational and foundational for a business, and that it's something you can measure and you can build. And so that just like at a high level, those were some of the things. It felt like this exclamation point on
Mm,
a lot of the work that I have done over the years, and even a lot of the frustration that I have felt. I think in the trust report, you focus on the three circles of trust. So the personal, then the team, then the organization. And there are so many things in each of those circles that jumped out at me that we can talk about. But I think one of the most important things that I want people to understand is that personal comes first. Like that is the first circle. So building that self-awareness in yourself, in your behaviors, in how you show up, understanding your core values, what your identity is rooted in, and really building up this strength in your own identity and leadership so that you can lead from that place has to come first. And so many times leaders have brought me in either as a full-time HR executive or as a consultant and coach, and they'll say, we're really struggling. We need to equip our leadership team, or we need to focus on our managers. And it's like I get in there and it's like, yes, they definitely need to be equipped, but guess what? We have to start with you, CEO, like your ability, your level of self-awareness, your ability to show up consistently in alignment with the values that you talk about, aligning your behaviors. Really, I haven't had the words to articulate it, I don't think, before the trust report.
Mm-hmm.
But really, all what I'm talking about with them is there is a lack of trust.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so starting in that personal, but so those trust circles for me were like really phenomenal.
Yeah, that is so good. It's so that when you think about those circles, and this is one of the questions that I was thinking about our conversation for today, that I actually wanted to talk about the circles of trust with you, and what Stephen Covey calls it. He calls those waves of trust. He actually uses the same
Mm,
framework, and it's any good leadership theory really should, or theory then applied, should cover those areas. And I think one of the things that I love that you just bottom shelved, and when I say bottom shelf, like that's a huge compliment because it's like you made it approachable, is that I would want every leader to hear is that just that reality that, okay, if I'm going to think about a trust building effort, and by the way, anything in organizations requires this way of thinking, but so often we miss this. We have to be thinking through those layers, the individual layer, and then we have this interactive layer where, okay, we start to talk to each other, we start to work together. I mean, you take trust is an inherently relational concept, and then we get to the organizational level. So we call that the awareness within, the patterns between, and then the conditions around.
mhm,
And so often, Sam, I see senior leaders, that's a big aha for them. Is like it gives them a structure that actually gives them hope. Because now it's like, I know where the work needs to be done.
mhm.
Will you talk to us? And I want to dig into what you said about the personal level in just a minute, but will you talk to us about your work? Because you worked across all those layers,
Yeah.
all those different circles of trust. And I'm kind of curious about the challenge of working across them and between them as a leader, as the kind of strategic leader that you have been.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to think about trust. I've been in very few organizations that I've been in, I would say have this what you call a stronghold of trust, and everyone exists in it. I think it has been more common in my experience that there are high levels of team trust. So teams almost develop like a subculture within the culture. They can count on each other. They build and give each other what they feel they need. And that
Mhm.
a lot of times will make them stay in an organization, even if the organization is dysfunctional to some level, they will stay out of allegiance to each other and a feeling of belonging that they have at that team level. And I've seen really great work come out of those teams. I think where I have seen the most struggle is a lack of trust in leaders, in
Mhm.
leadership teams. And, it can be very complex to step into an organization. I stepped into an organization at one point that I came in. They touted that they had a fabulous, strong culture. Their retention, I mean, they barely had lost any employees in years.
Mhm.
And so on face value, it was like, okay. When I stepped into the organization, it became apparent to me right away that the teams had siloed themselves and had very strong relationships. The reason the retention was high was because of that experience where the managers were trustworthy and they advocated for their people and they insulated their people. But then
Mm,
you had this massive disconnect where there was a distrust at that executive level, meaning employees didn't have a lot of faith that the executives that were making the big decisions at the company were going to be transparent
mm,
about communication or what was going on within the company. There was some infighting and conflict within the executive team, and so I stepped back and saw this, it sort of seeped out into the culture, this division. So it can be really complicated to step in, and you have the pressure. As when I was chief people officer, I had the pressure from the CEO saying, like, we want a strong culture, we want to clean things up, we want things to be better. But what that requires sometimes is a really courageous look at
mm,
yourselves
mm,
and your hiring and who is actually behaving at an executive level in a way that actually models the culture that you want. And I have been in situations where part of the requirement of building trust and building a culture that the CEO aspires to is firing some
mm,
high
mm,
level executives. And there is so much tension in those moments when I'm sitting across from a CEO and I'm saying, listen, you've got a lot of great things happening here. You have one leader who is not in alignment with the culture that you are working so hard to create, and in fact is really damaging. And most of the time, the CEO looks at me and says, I know. And then they say, but I can't let them go. They're too
mm,
afraid, right? I can't let them go. And I can't hold them accountable because I'm
mhm,
so afraid. And so we have these conversations where I say, you can't build an organization around a person, right? You build
mm,
it around the values and the culture that you want to create, and you make decisions from there. Your fear over letting this person go that's doing damage to your culture is going to have a ripple effect that will be massive in your business, and you are accountable to the business, not to this
mm,
person. Most of the time, the person does end up going. And some of the time, it's too late. It's after a lot of damage has been done, and then there's a lot of recovery effort
mm,
to rebuild
mm,
that trust. 100% of the time, when that person that is not in alignment gets moved on or moves on, 100% of the time, there has been a sigh of relief by the organization and a rebuilding with more energy and better outcomes. They go and suddenly it's like the clouds are parting.
mm, mm.
I can just picturing our quadrant. The data show that 48% of employees experience a daily reality of distrust,
Yeah.
even if their organization is in a high, in that stronghold in the high trust. So the organization is in this top quadrant, high organizational trust, high team trust, but their daily lived experience is still here. And I can imagine it because of the description of that you just gave. And I can see as you described that cloud, they're just moving up and to the right. Those decisions that are happening at the executive level are moving their people slowly up and to the right as they make the hard choice or have that hard conversation.
Yes, exactly. And you can, I mean, I think that's the thing that I love so much about this trust work is that if you are committed to it, you can build it.
Mhm,
But it does take a lot of courage to face where you don't have it or what's not working, and a lot of humility for leaders to acknowledge where they're missing the mark. And then this active course of action, intentional action to set things straight. And Rob, you were
mm,
the one who first said to me, I mean, now it's been maybe 3 years ago or so, that trust is an outcome. Like, trust doesn't just happen. We don't just look at people and say, trust me, and they trust us. I mean, very rarely, right? And so
yeah,
I thought about that a lot in my last experience, because it was like we had to do this major sort of deconstruction. And then it was just the steps, just keep taking the steps. And you have to understand and allow for people to decide they trust you whenever they get to that point that they trust you. The only thing you can do is take the intentional steps.
Yeah. Sam, I was curious about when you think about those circles of trust, where do most CEOs spend most of their time, their thinking, and on which level? Does it depend? Are they thinking mostly about the organizational level, kind of the issues at scale, the cultural kinds of things? Are they more dealing with just team related issues? So whoever's in the foxhole with them, when it comes to trust, or are many of them thinking about the personal level?
Ooh, that is a big question.
Uh,
Okay, I'm gonna think out loud here while I'm
yeah.
answering it.
It is a wild conversation. So
It
you,
is a wild conversation. And you know what? It might offend some of those CEOs out there. And so for any of you listening that are CEOs, I have so much compassion
yeah.
for the position that you find yourself in, with the weight of an organization on you, of a culture, of setting the tone for trust and values. And so this is by no means a condemnation of that. I think it is an important role in the organization, and it is a lonely role in the organization. And so I'll just caveat it by saying that I think many CEOs that I have worked with, they aspire to spend their time thinking about trust at an organizational and team level. I think that is what they want to spend their time on. That is why when they start their companies, they start out by saying, I want to be a values-based company. Culture and people are, most important assets. And they start out with these good intentions. And then there is some pressure. There's pressure from shareholders in the company. There's external pressure from investors. There's pressure from employees and financial pressure of making payroll. So all of this pressure starts to creep in. I think one of the things that can happen when they start to feel this pressure is that things get a little bit confusing, and they spend more energy on the personal level because they go into this feeling of fear
Hmm.
over the burden that they have, and self-protection and their own success and their own identity. And so I've seen so many CEOs with really wonderful hearts. They do love people, they do want strong cultures, and then the pressure is on, and the pressure compounds, and they get these messages from the world around what success looks like. And success means raising money, success means a successful business and a high growth company, and all of these messages that they start to absorb and feel. And then suddenly their identity becomes built around not who they are and their love for people and their core values. Their identity starts to become attached to the worldly success of their company. And
Mm.
so that incites some fear in them around the outcomes. They start worrying about the outcomes. And then it creates this fear in them around, what does it say about me? If the company starts struggling, what does it say about me? If we can't raise the money, what does it say about me? And so it gets really confusing and distracting, versus if they are able to not attach their identity to the success of the company, but they are focusing their identity and the outcomes on the impact that they have on human beings. I think it allows them to stay in that space where they can go through the hardships. Again, this comes back to kind of that composure piece. They can go through the hardships, they can face the challenges organizationally, but they have this, what you, Rob, often refer to as this transcendent reason behind what they're doing, right? And so when you're functioning in that healthy way, I think it does allow CEOs to focus more on their executive team, how well it's functioning, trust at that level, and then how that is built out into the culture at that organizational level. But I
Mhm.
do think that because of the pressure and the messages and the weight of how we've decided as a society what success looks like, I do see most CEOs that I've worked with, they get suddenly really confused. They step away from functioning from their heart and their head, and they start functioning in their head. And then that creates this fear, which, we know we never make great decisions and build great relationships out of fear.
Yeah, it's very interesting the way you describe that, because when you think about that personal level of trust, that issue at that level, what it feels like you're describing is a reactive approach to trust and to just the situation that we're facing, as opposed to, in both of our way of saying, a more regulated emotional self-regulation is really at the bottom shelf level. It's your capacity to make a choice.
Yeah.
So it's like being able to choose as opposed to not, and there's all kinds of drivers of that. But when we talk about personal trust at a proactive level, not a reactive level, we're talking about the fundamentals of development. So taking an actual, an intentional approach to building that personal trust, as opposed to what you just described. It's like, I see that so often when it becomes fear-based, it's just a reaction.
Yep.
It's like, as opposed to being intentional about building those things. And I want to ask you about this because, measurement is, of course, so important to me. Not measurement for the sake of measurement, but measurement for the sake of intentionality. And also because measurement, as a recent guest of ours, Alexis Fink, said, is like, one thing that measurement does is it starts a great conversation. And it's like, Jackie, that my wife and I, we receive these dinners in the mail now that our sons are out. Like, it's like now we get the different companies that send you a meal, and you have the ingredients. And if I didn't have the ingredients and the instructions for how to mix those ingredients, I wouldn't be able to cook the meal. And the same thing's true with trust. Like, if we can, and so when we measure trust, it's not like asking people, do you trust us? It's actually looking at the ingredients. And if we can
Yes.
measure the right ingredients and how those things work out to create different flavors,
Yes.
then we can actually get, and I've seen CEOs, when they see this, like, I could actually look at the unique drivers in my business.
Yeah.
I've seen tears come out because they're like, I didn't know that I could do something about this.
Yes.
Will you talk to the concept of measurement? Like, why does measurement matter when it comes to something like trust?
Oh my gosh. I mean, honestly, being in the HR space and the leadership space, anything that we can measure to validate what a lot of people for years have considered sort of soft work gets me really excited, right? Measurement to me, it does a couple of things. One, it opens the door to real conversation. I've spent a lot of my career working with engineers and tech, but even more scientists in biotech. And so having, in honestly, all of the wild content, and then now specifically the trust report, having data and a data-driven approach to talk about things that feel like you're saying, sort of like ethereal, like they're floating around and hard to grab onto or quantify. So being able to do that, it opens their minds and it opens the door to good conversations.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our Wild Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.
The measurement piece is so important. And it's interesting because when you can measure something, you can see the tangible progress. And so culturally, it's interesting because I've been with companies, and we've done employee engagement surveys. Like that's, it's been around forever. Employee surveys, employee engagement surveys, now employee experience surveys. And a lot of times I caution organizations about doing them unless the executive team and specifically the CEO is ready to take action. And because as we all know, the biggest miss is when you do something like that to check the box and then you don't take action on the feedback or you're not transparent about it, it actually breaks down trust versus building. And there's a way to do it where you can measure, get a baseline of where you're at, and have this very trust building experience as you take action on the feedback. One
Yeah.
organization I was with, we did an employee experience survey. It was built around our values. The feedback, I was chief people officer at the time, the feedback was sobering. I hadn't been there very long. The disconnect and lack of trust in the executive team and the leadership team as a whole was dismal.
Hmm. Hmm.
But we had a benchmark. And so then we could start intentionally building in some activities. And one of the best activities that we did was internal work around starting to understand ourselves better. We brought wild leaders in to lead us through the Leading Under Pressure Index. We did a half day on it to start to understand the behaviors that were going on and existing that were actually breaking down
Hmm.
trust in
Hmm.
the environment. And so then about 6 months later, we did a pulse survey on those key areas that we had committed to making progress in. Our scores were in originally in the 50s and 60s, went to 85 and above. And it took work. But seeing, for me, it was exciting because seeing the measurement was like, you can't argue that this doesn't make a difference, right? You
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
can't argue that it doesn't make a difference. And so it pains me now, I think right now, just with the economic climate we're in, there's a lot of fear. And a lot
Yeah.
of times the
Yeah.
first thing to go out of people's budgets is the work that I do, is the
Hmm.
work that you do, right? It's like they're like, oh, well, that's kind of a development activity that's nice to have. And I want to like scream from the rooftop. It's like, no, this is actually the time that you need it the most.
Hmm.
This is
Yeah.
like the moments, right, that trust is built or broken. I think measurement it's so important.
I've heard it said, and I say it over and over, that what gets measured moves. And even that level of accountability that comes with knowing that somebody's paying attention to what we say and what we do. And if we're going to say and do what we said we're going to do. So I
Mhm.
love that, Sam. Going back to even our wild question that we opened up with, and what we've talked about before, your focus on compassion and empathy, but thinking about those leaders that you just talked about, what is your take on the need to be truthful and direct in those high pressure moments when you know the measurement is happening as it's related to empathy and compassion? What does it
Mm.
mean to stand in that paradoxical space when the pressure is on, when you are measuring trust in your organization, when you need to be truthful and direct, and at the same time as it relates to empathy and compassion as a CEO?
Such a good question.
Hmm.
And I think what always set me apart when I was in the corporate space was my ability to tell the truth and be direct and honest and say the hard things, balance that with the empathy and compassion. And so, I think, as I said, being CEO is a lonely role. I heard once that the two loneliest roles in an organization are the CEO and the head of HR. And it's like, oh yeah, I feel that. Like it's true, right?
Yeah.
No one usually checks in on, the head of HR checks in on the CEO, but no one really checks in on the head of HR. So if you're listening to this and you have a head of HR, you should check in on them. I think for me, my commitment to compassion, which really is experiencing another person's suffering and then taking action to ease their pain. Right. So you are like, I look at empathy as the gateway to compassion, and compassion is the key to meaningful change. And so empathy is, I am suffering with you. I can imagine how that might feel. Compassion is extending the hand and taking the action to help alleviate some of that suffering. And so when I'm in those high pressure moments with any leader or employee for that matter, when I'm in those high pressure moments where they have made a misstep or the company is really struggling or they are really struggling, My ability to remember their humanity in this and the weight that they have on them, while our leaders and executives and companies are paid to carry the pressure and paid to not spill that pressure out on those around them. They reap the rewards of being in that position. They also are humans having a very human experience. They are imperfect. And so for me, being truthful about, let's say, the impact that their actions are having on a team, on an environment, on another person, that is part of my commitment in my role as coach, as HR leader. I am accountable for shedding light on those things. I am accountable. I feel a very personal responsibility for not sugarcoating or putting things under the rug. Like that is an accountability that I take on when I step into a leadership role, as part of my role in serving the company. And then there is my personal philosophy and belief around people, which is that all people are imperfect and yet capable of greatness. And we all want to be seen, and compassion is the key to meaningful change. And so when I remember those principles while I'm telling the truth, it creates the setting that is safe for the leader to emote, to be frustrated, to also say the truth of their experience without me sitting in judgment of them. But it also doesn't let them off the hook, right? From serving the company well. That is their job. People are looking to them, and wanting to trust them with that. And so I think, now there are also times where I've had, as you can imagine, with all my years in HR, I've probably dealt with every sticky employee relations issue out there. I mean, some really dark things. I've had to terminate a lot of people. And at one point, actually, I had a CEO come to me after a really hard termination and say, gosh, you're really good at this. And I as someone who's a compassion person, I had to pause and I was like, oh, that's not really the legacy that I want to hang my hat on. She was really good at firing people. But I got to a point where I decided that if it had to be done, that I was going to accept that I was going to be the one to do it, because I could do it in a way that preserved the person, no matter what they've done. Now, it didn't mean they got to stay. It didn't mean that the conversations weren't rough and hard and, and sometimes really tricky. But it meant that in those conversations, there was a level of respect that I maintained for people, no matter what they've done. And then I move them on in a compassionate way, but in a firm way, right? In a way that says to the employees that are looking at us as executives, we trust you to do the right thing. We trust you to protect us. We trust you to be honest and address it when behaviors that aren't in alignment with our values are happening. But it is a challenge. And I'll tell you, for me, people don't realize this because I have developed an expertise around having those very difficult conversations, and being kind of in the fire in those conversations. And it has always been true for the last, I'm trying to think, I've probably done terminations over the last 20 years. It's always been true that after I cry in the bathroom or my car, and it's never because I don't think it was the right thing to do. I don't think I've ever actually had to terminate someone where I didn't actually believe it was the right thing to do. It's just because of the impact that I'm having on another human being's life.
Yeah. There's a couple things I just wanted to note that you have mentioned. One is that piece right there. I think one thing that we rarely talk about, because one of the things that we assess and trust that you have just gone deep into, is that one of the key drivers is a person's ability to be both truthful and clear on one side, and also caring and compassionate at the same time. And one of the ways to get at that, and the assessments we use for that, is to first of all, is understand that you likely have a default where our conversation started. And so when leaders can identify their default, they can see, because we don't all have the same challenge related to that. Like you just described your own nuance. And I would want people to hear that. Like you can get better at this, but the first step is to understand which way do you go? And we see that leaders have different emotional processing and different challenges related to those two things that at its simplest level is this: some are very clear and convicted, they don't have struggle with the truth telling, and then some are a little bit default more toward the emotional tissue and the connective tissue with people, and so they have other challenges to face in that reality. The second thing that you mentioned regarding measurement, Sam, and is that recently we had an organization where it was a bunch of senior leaders, probably 50 senior leaders in the room, and we presented their trust data, and their organization was 138% more likely to be in the stronghold than all the other organizations in our sample
Hmm.
that are all of our benchmark organizations. And they received that, and they're all kind of sitting there and like soaking this up. And I stood up and I said, "You all should be clapping." Because I said, what bothers me is, like, I watch, when you watch the Super Bowl, I'm always envious of NFL teams because they know who wins.
Mm.
You know what I mean? I'm not making it all about winning and losing. It's not about that, but they can see the score.
Yeah.
So when we actually had a number that was
Yes.
158% more likely to be in the stronghold than the rest of the organizations, I'm like, why aren't you clapping? And they all
Yeah.
stood up, and it was a massive, you know what I mean? I'm like, this is your Super Bowl. And so when you were talking about that
I love
the
that.
power of measurement and all that it does, but at the very baseline, it also gives us a score,
Yes.
a way to see where we are.
Yes.
So
It's so
thanks.
true. You know what I'm thinking about too, Rob, what you just said about clarity. Sometimes I think for leaders that we work with, trust, leadership skills, some of these things, can feel a little bit squishy, as we've talked about. And I've seen a lot of leaders in when we're thinking about like the truth telling or the peacekeeping, they will sort of water down the truth in order to keep the peace, right? And so they think they're being kind or they're being clear. One of the things that's so important and one motivation for leaders, if they dig into this trust report, is when you're not clear, it deteriorates trust. If you are on point and accountable for being clear and you are not clear, it actually works against you and deteriorates trust. And can you use that as a motivation to practice your truth telling with compassion? I see that so often because we start to make assumptions that people are going to understand what we mean, and we all sort of look at the world the same way. And so CEOs will say, I did give the feedback, and it's like, no, did you actually say you are going against our values in these specific ways? This behavior can no longer continue, right? Were you specific and clear? And so often at the end of the day, they're not clear because they're trying to keep the peace because of the fear of what will happen if they don't keep the peace. And then it ends up actually hurting them because they are not only stunting someone else's growth by not being clear and giving them an opportunity to develop, but they are also acting not in a trusting way.
I mean, there's so many ways we could go with this
I
conversation.
know.
Mhm.
I love it.
Continue, and we will continue it. Sam, thank you so much for being back here with us in this space on the Wild Conversation. And we're so thankful for your continued commitment to measuring and building trust together and being on mission. We're so thankful. We want our listeners to be able to know how to find you. So what is the best way for them to connect with you and the work that you're doing?
Yes, they can access my website, which is just samwilling.com. They can email me at sam@samwilling.com. I just have to end by thanking you all for just putting such amazing content out there. I've always been a fan of Wild, always. This work around trust is, I mean, we could talk about it for days. It is so important. And I know it's going to change leaders and organizations and people's lives. So
Yeah.
really love it.
Thank you for listening to this Wild Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.